Under the cover of twilight, the shack behind the feed store was thick with the stench of sweat, kerosene, and a silence purchased for far less than it was worth. The iron cuffs had left raw, red marks on Clara's wrists, and her swollen belly heaved as she sat on the dirt floor, her gaze fixed on nothing. 8 months gone and you ain't thought she needs a doctor? Elias's voice, low and gravelly, cut through the oppressive quiet. It held no anger, no kindness, only the deep, settled weariness of a man who had seen too much. She needs a husband, not a damn sawbones, spat the older woman, her cracked lips curling. She shifted her weight from one muddy boot to the other. A man like you ought to know the difference. I do not need a wife, Elias said. His eyes weren't on Clara, but somewhere beyond her, as if tracing ghosts in the wood-grain walls. I need quiet. The exchange was made without another word. 2 dull silver coins, a jug of whiskey, and a promissory note for half a butchered steer come autumn. The mother unlatched the cuffs as if she were untying a sack of potatoes and shoved Clara toward the door. Don't give him trouble, she muttered. He paid more than you're worth. Elias did not touch her. He only nodded toward the waiting horse, its mane slick with sweat. Clara climbed up, her movements slow and deliberate, a fire burning in her eyes and her throat aching with the effort of not crying. The ride to his homestead was a silent procession through 3 miles of dust-choked trails, where pine-lined shadows seemed to breathe in the fading light. His house was a solitary shape against the vast emptiness, a place where the world seemed to end. No neighbors, no fences, just wild land and a porch that looked as if it hadn't heard laughter in a decade. He helped her down, then motioned toward the door. Inside, the air was clean, too clean. There was no scent of tobacco or cheap perfume, only wood smoke and lemon oil. Over the mantel, a single photograph hung crooked. It was of a woman with bright eyes, her hands wrapped around a baby blanket that held only air. You can stay here, Elias said, pointing to a room on the left. The bed is firm. There's water by the stove. I won't come in without knocking. Clara didn't speak. Her fingers hovered near the hidden fold of her boot, where a thin blade she'd sewn in days ago offered a sliver of control. She gave a single nod and stepped inside. The room smelled of lavender and dust. The bed was covered in a quilt too fine for the rest of the house. Beside the dresser sat a brush, a mirror, and a pair of unused shoes. It was not a prison, but it felt like one. Later that night, long after the coyotes began their song to the stars, Clara lay awake. One hand rested on her belly, the other wrapped around the hilt of the small dagger. The baby kicked, and her breath caught. She listened for footsteps, but there was only the wind and the occasional creak of old beams settling. Around midnight, she slipped from under the quilt, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. The knife felt small but sharp in her palm as she crept toward the front room. No light, no sound but the frantic drumming of her own heart. She moved onto the porch. A thin, cold rain had begun to fall, whispering against the weathered wood. And then she saw him. He wasn't in bed. He wasn't watching her. He was kneeling on the wet boards, an oil lamp guttering beside him. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his hands steady as he threaded new leather into a torn saddle. The rain soaked his shirt and dripped from his hair, but he didn't seem to notice. He spoke softly, to no one at all. She always said this place needed mending. She meant more than the fence. Clara stood frozen, the knife hanging useless by her side. He looked up then, his gaze finally finding hers in the gloom. "Couldn't sleep," was all he said. She shook her head. He nodded once and returned to his work, his needle pushing through the quiet. Back in her room, Clara slid the knife under her pillow. It was not a gesture of trust. Not yet. It was something more complex, an acknowledgement of a sorrow that felt heavier than her own fear. In the morning, he left bread and blackberry jam on the table. No note, no questions. Just bread, and a silence that, for the first time, did not feel heavy. It felt still. The morning sun spilled through the lace curtains of her room, casting soft, golden shadows across the hand-stitched quilt. The scent of dried lavender mingled with something older, cedar, faint rose petals, and thyme. An unfinished hoop of embroidery sat on the windowsill, its thread trailing like a forgotten promise. Beside it, a book of psalms, its pages worn thin with use. Elias never entered her room. Each morning she would find warm cornbread left outside her door and a kettle already singing on the stove. Some days, he left neatly stacked firewood. Once a clean dress, mended and folded, at the end of her bed. He said little, offering only a nod when she passed. At night, the house was filled with the steady tick of the mantel clock and the crackle of firewood settling into ash. Clara had known homes where silence was a weapon, sharp and angry. This silence was different. It did not watch her with suspicion. It let her breathe. One afternoon, as clouds gathered low over the valley, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Before Clara could react, Elias opened the door. A woman in a black bonnet stood on the porch, her jaw set like stone. "Martha," Elias said, his voice even. "I came for eggs," the woman snapped, her eyes sliding past him to where Clara stood. "And to see this girl you brought in." Clara instinctively stepped back, the roundness of her belly unmistakable beneath her shawl. "Well," Martha hissed, her hands on her hips, "ain't she ripe? Barely grown herself and already swelled up like a fall pumpkin." "What's the matter, Elias? Town too quiet without a scandal?" She spat the words. "Didn't take you long, did it? After burying your wife, now you bring in some barefoot hussy from the flats. You always did like 'em young." Clara froze, but Elias simply looked at the woman, his expression unreadable. "You want eggs?" he asked. "Take them." He turned, walked into the kitchen, and returned with a small basket, which he held out without a word. Martha snatched it, her eyes still burning holes through Clara. "She won't last, you know. Trash never does." Elias said nothing. He stepped back, placed one hand gently on the door, and closed it. Not slammed it, just closed it. The click echoed in the silence that followed. Clara stood for a long time, her fingers resting on her belly. She waited for Elias to explain, to apologize, to tell her she was not what that woman said. But he didn't. He returned to the porch, took his place in the worn wooden rocker, and began whittling a piece of cedar, his gaze fixed on his hands. He had not defended her. He had not denied it. He had just shut the door. That night, brushing her hair before the mirror, Clara saw the portrait of the other woman watching from the wall. She whispered to it, almost without meaning to. "He's more afraid of their words than mine." And she realized then that he hadn't bought her to save her. He had bought her because ghosts were easier to live with than people, because silence could not accuse him of failing again. But she was not a ghost. She was alive, and her child would be too. The wind howled that night, a feral thing rattling the shutters and creeping through the floorboards. Clara lay in bed, muscles tense, counting the days. Nearly 2 weeks. The silence was no longer comforting. It felt like a rope slowly tightening. She rose without lighting the lamp and pulled on the long coat Elias had left for her. The blade in her boot was a grim reminder that freedom always came at a price. Stepping out the back door, the cold hit her like a slap. Snow had begun to fall, light but fast. She pressed on, her teeth clenched, not knowing where she was going, only that it was away. Away from the silent man and the ghost of a woman that haunted every corner of that house. A sudden, sharp twist of pain in her side stopped her. She gasped, grabbing the railing as another jolt, lower and stronger, shot through her. She doubled over, falling to her knees in the stinging snow. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts. "No," she whispered, pressing a palm to her taut belly. "Not now, please, not now!" Heavy, fast footsteps crunched behind her. Then Elias's voice, rough with urgency. "Clara." She couldn't answer. The pain surged again. Then his hands were under her, lifting her as if she weighed nothing, her body pressed against the soaked wool of his coat. He carried her back inside, past the fire, and laid her gently on the quilted bed. He knelt beside her, his face flushed from the cold, and placed a calloused hand on her stomach. His voice was low and strained. "Do not let your child die because of what people say." His words struck her like thunder. She stared at him, and in that moment, he was not the silent man who shut the world out. He was someone who knew, intimately, what it was to lose. Later, when the pain had dulled, Clara spoke for the first time of her past. "She wanted me to serve drinks," she said, her eyes on the dancing flames in the hearth, "to pour whiskey, and sit on laps, and smile like nothing mattered. The miners paid better if the girl was pretty." She paused, her fingers gripping the quilt. "I said no. Once. She locked me in the goat shed for 2 nights. After that I stopped saying no." Elias said nothing, his shoulders tense as he stared into the fire. "I ran," Clara continued. "Found a job cleaning sheets at a boarding house. That's where I met him. The father. He was kind, until he wasn't. I don't even know if he knows. I don't know if I want him to." Elias nodded once, slowly. He rose, set a fresh log on the fire, and left her to sleep. But sleep did not come easy. Sometime after midnight, she woke to a faint, heartbreaking sound. Crying. It was coming from outside her room. She followed the sound and stopped at the end of the hallway. Through the open doorway, she saw Elias seated by the window, moonlight tracing silver lines across his face. In his lap lay a tiny, hand-stitched dress, as pink and delicate as a sigh. He held it as one might hold a memory they were afraid to break. "She made it after the third," he said softly, without turning. "Still believed it'd be different next time." Clara stepped closer, her voice a whisper. "The third what?" "The third loss," he said. "She lost 7. I buried each of them behind the ridge. We never named them." He traced the hem of the dress with one finger. "I buried this one with her. Couldn't look at it anymore." Clara stood in the doorway, the air thick with a sorrow that stretched beyond years. And she understood. He did not shut the world out because he was cruel. He shut it out because it had already taken everything he had ever dared to love. The next morning, The snow had begun to melt. Clara watched Elias saddle his horse, his movements slow and precise as always. But the quiet between them had changed. It was no longer made of fear, but of shared sorrow. After he rode off, she wrapped herself in a shawl and followed a narrow trail behind the barn, past the chicken coop, and up a gentle rise where the trees grew sparse. At the top of the ridge, she saw them. 7 small markers, weathered and uneven, arranged in a line like forgotten prayers. No names, just numbers crudely etched into the wood. Her breath caught. She knelt before the last one, the 7th. The earth there was newer, the grass still struggling to grow. A single stunted wildflower leaned against the marker as if in mourning. She reached out and laid her hand on the wood, and the tears came. Not for her own fear or loneliness, but for the weight of it all, for the silence she had mistaken for menace, the grief she had mistaken for cruelty. She cried for the 7 small hopes buried in the thin soil, for him, for herself. She didn't hear him approach, but when she turned, he was there, standing at the edge of the grove with his hat in his hand. "I thought you killed her," Clara whispered, her voice thick. "I thought," they said. "I know what they say," Elias replied softly, "and I let them." "Why?" "Because arguing takes more breath than silence." His eyes drifted to the markers. Each one took a little more from her, from me. By the 7th, there was nothing left. He gestured to the plot of earth. "She tried to plant roses here. They never grew. Soil's too thin. Wind takes the petals." Clara stood, her hand brushing the edge of the wooden cross. "Maybe this spring," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "We try again." For the first time, something flickered in his face. Disbelief, perhaps, or something closer to hope. He gave a single, sharp nod, the way a man does when he hears something he didn't realize he desperately needed to hear. They stood there a while longer, under a sky that promised more cold before warmth, and then walked back down together, their steps slow, even, and side by side. The days lengthened. Stubborn shoots of green poked through the frozen ground. The quiet in the house shifted, too. Clara no longer waited for Elias to leave. She joined him, handing him nails as he mended the fence, passing him boards as he patched the woodshed roof. At noon, she cooked for them both. Most times he listened while she spoke, and every evening as the fire crackled, she read aloud from the worn Bible in the kitchen hutch. "What does it mean?" she asked one night. "Sorrow may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." Elias looked up from the spoon he was carving. "It means sometimes you have to lose something to understand what's worth finding." One afternoon, Clara found him by the south fence, tending to a line of wooden stakes. Beside each one, half buried in the freshly turned earth, sat a bulb. "You're planting roses again," she said. He wiped his hands on a rag. "They won't take. Never have." Clara crouched slowly, pressing her hands into the cool soil. "Then why keep trying?" Elias shrugged. "Because she believed they would. She said even the hardest ground gives in if you're patient enough." He hesitated, then met her eyes. "I never believed it, but I kept planting. Because when she looked out and saw them, even the ones that didn't bloom, she smiled like they did." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. She reached for one of the stakes, gently turning the soil to cover the bulb. "I think she was right." Later that night, as wind whispered against the windows. Clara sat at the table, one hand on her stomach. The baby kicked, rhythmic and strong. "If it's a girl," she said softly, "I'll name her Rose." Elias looked up from his whittling. His eyes met hers, quiet and steady. "She'll be stubborn," Clara added, a faint smile touching her lips. "She'll have to grow here." Elias didn't smile, but the lines around his eyes softened. He simply nodded, and in that shared silence something new and fragile full, like the first green shoot of spring, finally began to take root. "She'll grow where no one thinks she can," Clara had said, "even if it takes time." Elias set down the small bird he was carving from a piece of scrap wood. He didn't nod quickly, but with a slow, considered weight that gave his agreement substance. "That's a good name," he rumbled, "and a better hope." The silence that fell between them that night was different. It was no longer a wall of things unsaid, but a shared space, a fallow field waiting for seeds to bloom, the quiet pause between a heartbeat and a breath. For the first time in weeks, Clara did not dream of the grit and grime of the mining town, or the stinging memory of her mother's fists, or the sour smell of whiskey on a stranger's coat. She dreamed of sunlight filtering through rose petals, of small, clumsy hands tugging at her braid. She dreamed of Elias smiling, not just with his mouth, but with his whole face, as a little girl with dirt-streaked cheeks chased chickens through a meadow of wildflowers. And in the dream, the roses bloomed. Not perfectly, not all at once, but it was enough. The wind that night was wrong. Hot, dry, and charged with an electric stillness that silenced even the coyotes. The sky above the ridge bled into a bruised, violent purple, and thunder rolled low and deep, a warning drum from the heavens. Elias stood on the porch, a silhouette against the darkening world, watching the distant mountains. A jagged fork of lightning split the horizon, and seconds later, a crack of thunder tore through the silence. Then came the smell, acrid, biting, the smell of burning pine. Clara was setting the last of the dishes on the table when the first curl of gray haze drifted through the open window. She froze, her nostrils flaring. Inside her, the baby shifted restlessly, a sudden, anxious flutter. The door burst open. "Fire!" Elias said, his voice tight. "Up by Briar Ridge, the wind's bringing it our way." He was already grabbing blankets from a chest. Clara hurried to the doorway. On the distant slope, flames flickered like a swarm of angry stars falling to earth. "We have to move," Elias commanded, shoving cloths into a bucket of water. "The old stone hut, up the north trail. It's safe there." Clara nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. But as she turned to grab her coat, a sharp, white-hot pain shot through her spine, doubling her over. "Elias," she gasped, her knuckles white as she gripped the table. He was at her side in an instant, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "It's time," she whispered, panic clawing at her throat. "The baby. It's coming." Another contraction seized her, harder this time, stealing her breath and her strength. The smoke was thickening, turning the air hazy and gray. The fire was coming, and it was coming fast. Elias didn't hesitate. He soaked 2 blankets in the bucket, draping one around her shoulders and the other over his own head and back. Then, with arms like iron, he lifted her as if she weighed nothing, cradling her pregnant belly protectively against his chest. "Hold on," he gritted out, and kicked the door open into chaos. The world outside had turned a terrifying, flickering orange. Ash drifted down like poisoned snow, and the wind screamed across the field, carrying a deadly cargo of sparks. The trail to the stone hut was a narrow ribbon twisting through a ravine choked with dry brush, perfect tinder for the hungry flames. But Elias knew the way by heart. He moved with a desperate speed, his breath coming in ragged bursts, his boots pounding a frantic rhythm on the dry earth. Clara cried out as another contraction tore through her. "I can't," she sobbed into his chest. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," Elias grunted, his voice a raw thing of pure will. "Just breathe. Hold on to me." The fire was at their backs, a monstrous, crackling beast. Smoke poured down the trail like a black tide, scorching their lungs. Clara buried her face against him, trying to block out the searing heat, the terror, the relentless pain. Each of his steps was a jolt. Each breath tasted of cinders. Just as her vision began to tunnel to black, they were there. The old stone hut, built into the hillside, part root cellar, part forgotten memory. It had been a birthing place once, long ago, when his hope had still lived. Elias kicked the heavy wooden door open, carried her inside, and gently set her down on a bed of clean straw. The air inside was cool, the thick stone walls a fortress against the inferno. He worked quickly, arranging the blankets, fetching water from a barrel in the corner, lighting a small oil lamp that cast flickering shadows on the stone. Outside, the fire roared, but the hut muffled the sound to a distant, rolling thunder. Clara screamed as another wave of pain crested. Her body buckled. She clutched his hand, her nails digging into his flesh. "I'm scared," she wept. "So am I," he admitted, his voice low as he knelt beside her. "But you are not alone." Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time dissolved into a blur of pain and smoke and whispered words of encouragement. He wiped her brow, held her hand, and stayed. He had seen death claim 7 women in childbirth before. But this time, he fought. He fought for Clara, for the baby, for a future he hadn't dared to imagine. And then, after a final raw cry that seemed to tear Fong from the very earth, there was a sudden, breathless silence. It was broken, not by the fire, but by another sound. A high-pitched, indignant wail. New, alive. A baby's cry filled the stone hut. Clara gasped, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Elias carefully wrapped the small, red, squirming bundle in a clean cloth and placed her in Clara's arms. "A girl," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Clara laughed through her tears, pulling the child close. "Rose," she choked out. "Her name is Rose." Outside, the great fire was beginning to lose its fury. Inside, a new life had just begun. The first light of dawn, soft and golden, seeped through cracks in the stone, carrying the scent of scorched earth and something else, the scent of a beginning. The baby's cry rang out again, fierce and full of purpose. It was not the whimper of a fragile thing, but the roar of a survivor. It was a sound that hadn't been heard in that place for 10 long years, and it shattered a decade of silent grief. Elias knelt beside them, his hands stained with soot and blood, his shoulders shaking with a profound, bone-deep relief. He looked at Clara, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a fierce maternal light. The baby, slick and new, rooted against her, tiny fingers curling and uncurling like petals in the sun. "She's strong," Clara whispered. "She's loud, Elias rasped, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. For a moment, the lines of sorrow on his face seemed to soften. He reached out a trembling hand, and with one soot-stained fingertip, gently brushed the baby's cheek. She was impossibly soft. She let out a tiny, perfect yawn that seemed to break open something sealed shut inside of him. Rose, he murmured, the name a prayer on his lips. She'll be Rose. You named her, Clara said, her voice full of wonder. No, Elias said softly. You did. I believe it now. He slumped against the stone wall, the immense weight of the night finally catching up to him. The smoke had seeped into the hut, a pale, lingering ghost. In the dim light, Elias's face was ashen. His lips were cracked, his eyes suddenly dull. Clara's smile vanished. Elias? He didn't answer. Elias, she said again, louder, a cold dread snaking up her spine. The baby whimpered, sensing her mother's fear. Clara reached for him, her fingers closing around his forearm. It was heavy, limp. He slid sideways, collapsing to the floor, like a puppet with its strings cut. No, Elias, no, she cried, shifting Rose into the crook of one arm and dragging herself toward him, her knees scraping on the rough floor. Look at me. Stay with me, do you hear me? She pressed her ear to his chest, holding her breath. She heard it. Faint. Shallow. But there. Please, she begged, pressing her forehead to his shoulder. Don't leave us. Not now. She shook him, but he remained motionless. And then Rose let out a cry. It was not a cry of hunger or fear. It was a piercing, angry wail that ripped through the silence, a demand, a call to life itself. Elias gasped, a deep, shuddering intake of air. His eyes fluttered open. They found her face. She's got lungs, he croaked. Clara broke into a sound that was half laugh, half sob. So do you. He managed a faint smile as his eyelids drifted shut again. Guess I'll need them. And in that battered, soot-blackened hut, as the fire outside smoldered into memory, the three of them breathed. Wrapped in silence and smoke and the fragile, ferocious miracle of survival. Bound not by blood, but by a cry that had named a child and resurrected a man. Bound by a rose that had bloomed in the heart of the ruins. 1 year later, the house that had once stood in silence now hummed with a life it had never known. The wooden fence, once broken, was now sturdy and straight, woven through with the soft green vines of returning spring. By the front window sat a cradle, carved from cedar and smoothed by loving hands, where a baby now stood, taking her first wobbling steps. By the porch, the rose bushes had bloomed. Not perfectly, not all at once, but enough. Stubborn, tender petals of delicate pink opened to the sun, a testament to life in a place where only failure had grown before. Laughter now echoed from the kitchen, where Clara stirred a pot of stew, humming as Rose babbled on the floor, clutching a wooden spoon like a scepter. At the table, Elias sat mending a doll's torn arm with the same quiet patience he had once reserved for saddles and shoes. Letters began to arrive, tied with blue ribbon or tucked inside baskets of cornbread and jam. Some were apologies, some were blessings. All came from the same mouths that had once whispered such cruelty. They left quilts and tiny wool socks, and a note scribbled in a child's hand that read, "Sorry for what my mama said." The porch, once a place of solitude, became a gathering spot on warm evenings. Neighbors would stop by, awkward at first, carrying pies and hesitant stories. Clara never asked why they had come. She simply passed around the tin cups and waited for them to come again. One morning, Clara held Rose on her hip, pointing to the flowers by the fence. "She called you Bay yesterday," she said, a playful smile on her lips. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Before Ma?" Clara laughed. "Twice. I counted." He chuckled, a quiet, familiar sound that still made her chest ache in the very best way. "Clever one." "She's yours," Clara said softly, the words meaning so much more. He reached out and brushed the child's cheek. "Ours." That evening, as the sun melted like amber across the valley, Rose toddled barefoot through the yard, her curls bouncing, one chubby hand clutching a freshly picked rose. She squealed at a butterfly, stumbled, and pushed herself right back up, undeterred. Clara watched from the porch, one hand resting on her belly, round once more with new life. Elias stood beside her, his arm wrapped gently around her. The land, once scorched and barren, was green again, and as Rose ran laughing into the golden light, the petals of her flower trailing behind her like a promise, Clara whispered to herself, "Sometimes, things must be lost to make room for what is found. Even in a world turned to ash, a garden can grow." If this story stirred something in your heart, if you felt the quiet strength of a man who thought he had nothing left to give, the resilience of a woman who rose from the ashes of betrayal, and the profound miracle of a flower blooming in the ruins, then let us know with a like, a comment, or by subscribing to our channel. This is Wild West Love Stories, where forgotten romances are brought back to life, where broken hearts learn to beat again, and where hope grows in the most untamed of places. Subscribe and stay with us through every tale of longing, redemption, and a love that defied the frontier. And don't forget to hit the bell so you never miss a story where the bullets missed, but the heart never did. Thank you for riding with us. We'll see you in the next story.